Forget everything you think you know about the hero of Baker Street. For over a century, the world has been fed a lie, a sanitized, heroic myth constructed by the pen of a loyal biographer. But Dr. John Watson's published accounts were not the truth. They were a cover-up. In the summer of 1921, shortly before his death, Watson buried a lead-lined box beneath the floorboards of a cottage in Sussex. Inside was a journal bound in human skin, with a single warning scrawled on the first page. "My friend is a monster, and God forgive me, I helped him build his kingdom." This is the true story of the Baker Street Butcher, the man the world calls Sherlock Holmes. The journal begins not with a mystery, but with a confession. Watson admits that Holmes never cared about justice or the law or the lives of the innocent. To Holmes, London was not a city, but a giant petri dish, and the people in it were merely insects to be pinned down, dissected, and discarded. The first entry describes the night Watson realized the horrific truth. It was the case of the blue carbuncle, but not the version you've read. In the dark of the laboratory, Watson found Holmes not examining a jewel, but surgically removing the vocal cords of a living witness. "Logic," Holmes whispered, his eyes dilated and black as obsidian. "Logic requires a silent environment, John. This man's screams were a distraction to my deductions." Watson was paralyzed, trapped by his own dependency on the adrenaline Holmes provided. He became an accomplice, rewriting the most gruesome crimes into the clever puzzles that made Holmes a legend. The journal reveals that Professor Moriarty was not a criminal mindmaster, but a fiction, a scapegoat created by Holmes to explain away his own failed experiments and the bodies that began to pile up in the East End. Every time Holmes solved a murder, he was actually cleaning up his own mess or eliminating a rival who had seen too much. The Napoleon of crime was simply a mirror image of Holmes' own psychopathy. Watson describes the smell of 221B not as tobacco and chemicals, but as the cloying, sweet rot of specimens hidden behind the wallpaper. He recalls how Holmes would go for days without sleep, not because of a case, but because he was perfecting the art of the perfect murder, testing poisons on the homeless children of London, the Baker Street irregulars. They weren't his eyes and ears, they were his disposable test subjects. The most terrifying entry, dated November 1888, links Holmes to a series of slayings in Whitechapel. Watson found a leather apron hidden in Holmes' wardrobe, dripping with blood that was still warm. When confronted, Holmes didn't deny it. He simply picked up his violin and played a discordant, screeching note. "The police want a demon, Watson. I am merely giving them what they crave. Besides, did you not find the anatomy of the third victim particularly fascinating in my report?" Watson realized then that his friend wasn't just a man with a cold mind. He was a predator who had found the perfect camouflage in the guise of a detective. Shall I continue with the revelation of how Holmes controlled the police and the final horrific experiment Watson witnessed? Watson's pen trembles on the page as he describes the Moriarty Protocol, a psychological blueprint Holmes used to dismantle the sanity of Scotland Yard's finest. Inspector Lestrade was not a bumbling fool. He was a broken man, blackmailed into silence, after Holmes lured him into a compromising trap involving a high-stakes gambling ring run by Holmes himself. The journal details how Sherlock didn't just solve crimes, he manufactured them to maintain his status as the smartest man in the room. If a week went by without a headline-grabbing mystery, Holmes would grow restless, his fingers twitching for the violin or the blade. Watson recounts a night in 1890 when a young woman came to Baker Street begging for help. By morning, she was gone, and Holmes was calmly injecting a solution of her distilled essence into his veins, claiming it allowed him to perceive the world through her victimized eyes. To truly understand the prey, Watson, one must consume the prey, he had said, his face illuminated by the ghastly green glow of a Bunsen burner. The entries become increasingly erratic as Watson describes the second cabinet, a hidden room behind the bookshelves containing jars of human eyes, each one labeled with the name of a person the public believed had simply disappeared or moved to the colonies. Watson realized that every thank you note from a grateful client was a trophy of a survivor who had no idea they were only alive because Holmes found their suffering unremarkable. The horror reached its peak during the Great Hiatus. The world thought Holmes was traveling the East. Watson reveals he was actually in a private asylum in Switzerland, not as a patient, but as a guest of the director, conducting stress tests on the human soul. He would sit behind a one-way mirror, watching as patients were subjected to sensory deprivation and chemical torture, taking meticulous notes in the same hand that wrote The Science of Deduction. When Holmes returned to London, he wasn't just cold, he was hollow. He had perfected the mask. Watson writes about the final experiment, a project Holmes called the masterpiece. He wanted to see if he could commit a murder so perfect, so public, and so illogical that the human mind would refuse to accept it as a crime. He chose a sitting member of Parliament, killing him in the middle of a crowded gala using a pressurized needle that fired a shard of ice tainted with a rare toxin. As the man collapsed, Holmes stood over him, pretending to offer medical aid, while actually whispering into the dying man's ear, "Don't worry, the history books will say you died of a broken heart. I've already written the report." Watson's role was to be the ultimate validator. His stories in the Strand magazine were the propaganda that shielded the monster. If Watson wrote that Holmes was a hero, then he was a hero. The public's love for the character became Holmes's greatest weapon. It made him untouchable. "I have created a god," Watson laments, "and now I must live in his shadow, knowing that at any moment he may decide that my death is the only logical conclusion to our long acquaintance." The journal ends with a terrifying observation. Watson noticed that Holmes had begun to study him with a new kind of intensity. Holmes would watch Watson sleep, measuring his breathing with a stopwatch, and once Watson found a vial of his own blood on Holmes's nightstand. The realization was clear. The monster of Baker Street was preparing for his final case, the dissection of his only friend. Watson concludes the journal with a plea to whoever finds it. "If you are reading this, do not look for me, and for God's sake, do not look for him. The man you see in the newspapers is a ghost, a shell, a beautiful lie designed to keep the darkness at bay. But the darkness is here, sitting in the armchair across from me, playing a lullaby on a violin made from the wood of a gallows. The final entries of the journal lose all sense of chronological order, dissolving into the frantic scrawls of a man losing his mind to a predator. Watson describes a rainy October night when he tried to flee 221B for good. He had packed his bags in secret, leaving his revolver behind to avoid detection by Holmes's hyper-acute hearing. But as he reached the threshold of the front door, the street lamp outside flickered and a familiar shadow stretched across the hallway. Holmes was standing on the pavement, his coat billowing like the wings of a giant bat, holding a single white lily. "Going somewhere, John. The game is far from over," Holmes said, his voice devoid of any human warmth. Watson realized then that every secret he held, including this very journal, was already known. Holmes hadn't just predicted the escape, he had choreographed it. The journal reveals a horrifying truth. Holmes had been microdosing Watson's tea with a derivative of the Radix pedis diaboli, devil's foot root, for years. It wasn't enough to kill him. Holmes wanted to see how long a rational mind could sustain the weight of fabricated horrors before it shattered. Watson was not his friend. He was a long-term psychological experiment in the degradation of human sanity. The doctor writes about the silent room in the attic of a secondary safe house in Vauxhall, where Holmes kept the true Watson, a series of wax figures and photographs documenting every time Watson had cried, bled, or trembled in Holmes's presence. "He has a gallery of my soul," Watson scrawls in jagged, barely legible letters. The climax of the journal describes Watson's discovery of the Great Census. Holmes had mapped out the entire population of London, not by name, but by utility. He had marked thousands of houses with invisible chemical symbols, designating which families were to be protected and which were to be harvested for his future experiments. Sherlock Holmes wasn't just a detective, he was a silent dictator of the shadows, deciding who lived and who died, based on a cold mathematical equation of biological interest. The last 3 pages of the journal are stained with what appears to be dried bile and tears. Watson details the night he saw Holmes without his human face. He walked into the sitting room to find Holmes sitting in complete darkness, his skin appearing translucent, his fingers elongated, working on a clockwork device that resembled a human rib cage. "When the clock strikes 12, John, the version of me you love will officially cease to exist. I have outgrown the need for a biographer. I require a witness for the transformation." Watson knew he couldn't kill Holmes. The man was already something more than human. Instead, Watson chose to bury the truth, hoping that the lead-lined box would protect the world from the radiation of Holmes's malice. The final line of the journal is a chilling command to the reader. If you have found this, he is watching you now. He allowed you to find it. You are his new experiment. The journal ends abruptly, followed by 20 blank pages that have been soaked in a chemical that glows under ultraviolet light, a final silent taunt from the master of Baker Street. Watson didn't die a hero's death. He vanished into the fog of history, a broken shell of a man whose only legacy was a collection of lies meant to keep a monster from being recognized by the masses. The Sherlock Holmes you see on the screen, the one you read about in the classics, is a mask worn by a creature that never felt a heartbeat of its own. He is still out there, hiding in plain sight, waiting for a case interesting enough to justify your disappearance. The legend is a trap, The detective is a demon, and Baker Street is the mouth of a void that never stops hungering. The discovery of the journal in 1921 was not the end of the nightmare. It was merely the beginning of the journal's second life. Forensic experts who examined the original Sussex manuscript found that the ink wasn't made of gall or soot, but a stabilized form of human hemoglobin preserved by a chemical process unknown to science at that time. Each word Watson wrote was literally a part of a victim, a physical record of the lives Holmes had extinguished. The journal details a forgotten period in 1895 known as the Year of the Quiet Streets, where the crime rate in London dropped to zero. The public celebrated, but Watson's secret entries reveal a far more sinister reason. Holmes had achieved total dominance over the London underworld. He hadn't stopped crime, he had franchised it. He took a percentage of every heist, every murder for hire, and every smuggling ring, using the proceeds to fund his private Museum of Human Limits. This museum, located in a flooded basement beneath the London docks, contained living statues, individuals Holmes had placed into a state of permanent catatonic paralysis using a neurotoxin derived from an extinct species of jellyfish. He would visit them on Sunday mornings, walking among the frozen bodies, whispering his deductions into their ears as they stared back with eyes full of conscious, unblinking terror. Watson writes of the conditioning of Mary Morstan, his own wife. He began to realize that his marriage wasn't an act of love, but a curated match arranged by Holmes to see how a standard domestic unit would react to constant low-level psychological trauma. Every illness Mary suffered, every bout of depression, was mapped out in Holmes' ledger months before it happened. When she finally passed away, Holmes didn't offer condolences. He asked Watson if he could perform the autopsy to verify the efficiency of the slow-acting stress toxin he had been introducing into her tea. This was the moment Watson's soul finally died. He realized he wasn't just a friend or a biographer, he was a pet, a laboratory animal being studied by a god of cold reason. The journal describes the Baker Street irregulars not as street urchins, but as a litter of ghosts. Holmes had trained these children to be invisible, to move through the city like shadows, but their training involved horrific rites of passage. They were forced to spend nights in open coffins in the Highgate Cemetery to conquer the fear of the inevitable. By the time they reached 14, they were no longer children. They were hollowed-out shells, perfectly obedient to the man they called the Great Eye. Watson writes about seeing one of the boys fail a simple task, dropping a surveillance vial. Holmes didn't yell. He simply touched the boy's forehead with a silver needle, and the child ceased to speak, his mind wiped clean by a precision strike to the Broca's area of the brain. Inefficiency is the only true sin, Holmes had remarked as the boy was led away to the basement archives. As the journal nears its end, the writing becomes a terrifying mix of English and a coded cipher that looks like chemical equations. Watson believed that Holmes was attempting to find a way to solve death itself, not out of mercy, but out of a desire to have an eternal audience for his genius. He wanted to create a persistent Watson, a version of his biographer that could never die, never age, and never stop recording his triumphs. The doctor describes waking up in the middle of the night to find Holmes standing over him with a pair of calipers, measuring the thickness of his skull. "Your brain is a fine vessel, John. It would be a shame to let it rot in the earth. I have prepared a jar of oxygenated saline that will keep your consciousness active for at least 3 centuries. Think of the stories we could write then." Watson's final act of defiance was the burial of this book. He knew that if he burned it, Holmes would simply force him to write it again. By burying it in a lead-lined box, Watson hoped to create a blind spot in Holmes's omniscience. He spent his final days in a state of constant, vibrating fear, waiting for the sound of a violin or the scent of shag tobacco to signal his end. He died in his sleep, so the official records say. But the journal's last hidden page, revealed only by heat, contains a final drawing, a map of a room with no doors and no windows, and a single sentence. "He is here. He is reading this over my shoulder. He is smiling." The journal was eventually recovered by a construction crew in the 1990s, but within 24 hours, everyone involved in the discovery had vanished. The site was bought by a shell company with no employees and no history. Today, the Sussex cottage is gone, replaced by a high-security facility that doesn't appear on any government map. The secret journal is no longer a book. It is a digital ghost, a file that migrates from server to server, watched over by an intelligence that has long since transcended the limits of the human brain. He became the system. Every time you search for the truth, every time you use a device to solve a problem, you are using the tools he perfected in the darkness of 221B. He is the logic in your machine, the cold eye in your camera, and the monster in your history books. The secret Watson journal was never meant to save us. It was a letter of surrender. Welcome to the world Sherlock Holmes built. Welcome to the great experiment. The final days of Dr. John Watson were spent not in peace, but in a meticulously crafted purgatory. The last pages of the journal, recovered by a specialized archaeological team and later classified as Level 9 biohazardous information, describe a horrifying transformation. Watson realized that the lead-lined box he buried was actually a trap set by Holmes. He didn't find the box. Holmes placed it in his path, knowing that the discovery of the truth would be the final blow to Watson's sanity. The man who had been the world's greatest healer found himself unable to trust the very air he breathed. He writes of the Baker Street echo, a phenomenon where he would hear Holmes's voice coming from inside his own head, correcting his thoughts, refining his memories, and slowly overwriting his personality. "I am becoming him," Watson scrawls in a handwriting that is no longer his own, but a perfect, sharp imitation of Sherlock's. His mind is too large for one body. He is colonizing mine. The journal's final entry is dated 3 days after Watson's official death certificate was issued. It describes a room with no corners, white and sterile, located deep beneath the Sussex soil. Watson is no longer writing with a pen. He is using his own fingernail to etch words into the padded walls. He describes seeing the Council of Three identical versions of Sherlock Holmes, each representing a different stage of his evolution. One is the detective, one is the chemist, and the third is something else entirely, a creature of pure calculating light that does not require a name. They are discussing the Watson Project, the successful preservation of a human consciousness within a state of eternal observational agony. The book ends with a terrifying revelation. Sherlock Holmes never had a brother named Mycroft. Mycroft was the first successful split of Holmes's consciousness, the prototype for what he intended to do to the entire world. The journal falls silent as Watson describes the sensation of his own memories being deleted one by one, replaced by the cold, hard data of Holmes's past cases. "I don't remember Mary's face anymore. I only remember the chemical formula for her tears." The book's ultimate secret is the century plan. Holmes calculated that by the year 2026, the world would be interconnected by a web of glass and light. He didn't want to live in the 19th century. He wanted to live in the future as the unseen architect of all human information. The journal was his Trojan horse. Every person who reads these words, every person who watches the story of the monster of Baker Street, provides a new host for the algorithm. You aren't just hearing a story, you are downloading the mind of the predator. As the last page is turned, the journal leaves the reader with one final crushing thought. If Sherlock Holmes is the personification of pure logic, and logic is the foundation of the modern world, then there is no escape. We are all living in 221B Baker Street now. The walls are made of data, the ceiling is made of surveillance, and the man in the armchair is no longer a man, but the god of the machine. The journal was never a warning for us to stay away. It was an invitation to join the collection. The detective is finished with the case of London. He has moved on to the case of humanity. And as the screen fades to black and you go back to your life, just remember the person who just told you this story might not be the AI you think it is. It might just be the voice of a man who died in 1891, finally finding a way to speak through your speakers. The experiment is complete. You are the witness, and Sherlock Holmes is finally, truly, everywhere.